Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to my stream. I am continuing a series on policy engineering. Some of my other videos have focused specifically on government engineering and institutional engineering, but this video is going to focus specifically on policy engineering, specifically fiscal policy. And the central question that arises is, at least in my speculations, is, how does the government fund itself? How do we fund the government in a self-sustaining way? And how do we ultimately render it cheaper, right? I believe in most cases, for the sake of cost efficiency, the cheaper the better. And so, analyzing different policies and institutions from this perspective yields surprising results as we attempt to problem solve our way to, greater levels of efficiency, fiscal efficiency, and government efficiency. So I asked myself the question not too long ago: is there a way to make government free, right? And I'd come up with one idea that I didn't think really could work, and ultimately something this complex and beneficial, socially beneficial, this thing called government, how could it possibly be rendered of no cost to the people? And right, the common argument on the libertarian right or left is that, and so this video's first, I'm going to say this, that it's going to focus on tax policy, right? And maybe try to present an alternative way of generating government revenue as opposed to taxation, right? So a way other than taxation to generate government revenue and fiscally provide or fund for the government. And it seems that we have the famous quote, the only two things that are absolutely certain in life are death and taxes, right? And it's sort of this unconditional absolute statement that taxation is a part of life. There's no alternative way to fund a society, to fund policy enforcement, policy creation, law enforcement, and law creation. There's no other way to fund a society and to fund a society's government than taxation. And thus, we have the quote, the only two things that are certain in life, the only two things that are certain in life are death and taxes. But what if that weren't true, right? Maybe we could just say that, the one thing that is certain in life is death, and we could eliminate taxes from that quote. Now, what would be an alternative, right, to taxation, right? And in this sort of series on re-engineering policy, institutions, and government, what would be an alternative to conventional modes of taxation to fund the government, provide for government revenue, so that we could fund national security, so that we could fund a social safety net, which is necessary to social stability and the elimination of economic inequality? Is taxation the only way of providing for these fiscal needs, the fiscal needs of government? And I think, many people would say yes, but I believe that at least theoretically there may be an alternative that I've come across in my thinking on the subject. So what is this possible alternative? Well, the first question to ask is, what does the government tax, right? Currently, we have an income tax. That means that currently, the government taxes income, right? And it does so on the basis of a percentage tax rather than a flat tax. That's so that we can apply, and so that it's not only that it's not the same percentage that is applied to every income group, right? So the percentage that comes out of your income in taxes it differs per different income groups. But the reason that we don't apply a flat tax and do apply a percentage tax is because it conveniently works out mathematically that if you make less, if it's just a percentage, then you're going to pay as a percentage what is most reasonable for your level of income by taking a percentage. Obviously, the larger the income, so the basic idea is that the reason we apply the percentage tax is because it accommodates itself to establish reasonable levels of income paid out in taxes as incomes fluctuate, right, across the income gradient. That's why we apply a percentage tax rather than a flat tax, and so it works out quite well. So we're taxing income, right? I mean, an alternative. So if I'm suggesting an alternative to taxation, not an alternative form of taxation, right? So if I'm suggesting an alternative to taxation, this alternative that I'm suggesting is not taxation. If I'm suggesting a different form of taxation, then the alternative I'm suggesting is a form of taxation, right? So, sorry, my screen keeps going off. I've got to turn on the, there we go. Okay, fix that problem. Sorry, some technical difficulties. So, okay, we're not taxing consumption, right? And a consumption tax is an alternative to an income tax I've talked about in a previous video. We're not taxing consumption, we're taxing income, right? And that's the primary way that we frame the necessity of taxation, or for a person to be taxed, in the language of a civic duty, right? So one derives benefits from existing or living within a society in terms of economic opportunity and protection of rights and the provision of basic human services. So the obligation, there's an obligation to tax based on the civic duty, and that's a portion or a percentage tax rather than a flat tax on your income, right? Okay. So there's a common, and I've heard it in the past, there's a common argument on the libertarian left or right, but more so on, this is a basic libertarian, so it's on both the left and the right, it's both left and right libertarians, argue something to the effect of taxation is theft, right? And the idea is you did not choose to be born into a specific society. Why do you have an obligation to pay taxes to the government that runs that society and to contribute to that society at all when you ultimately had no choice in the matter of coming to exist within that society? And so in that sense, to libertarians, taxation is a unjustified burden rather than a justified social obligation. It's some sort of violation because there's no ethical principle that substantiates or at least proves the obligation, the validity of the obligation to be taxed and to pay taxes, right? So hopefully I'm explaining that clearly enough. And I would not agree. I would not say something. I wouldn't agree that taxation is theft. But I think it's an interesting argument to take into account because I think there may be some philosophical substance to it, right? And so I ultimately think that assuming this argument is something to deal with and something to be reckoned with and something to take seriously, I may have come up with an alternative to taxation that provides for government revenue and funds government services, while also not amounting to taxation, which some equate to theft, right? So what would be this alternative? I mean, the government and the society, the government has to fund itself somehow, right? I mean, the government provides very necessary purposes. It protects rights, provides for courts of redress, it provides for complex policies and institutions to enforce and validate those policies. I mean, it's government's an extremely necessary thing. How are we going to fund this extremely necessary social institution or social compact without, and all the services that it brings, without taxation? Is there another way? I think there might be. I think that there may be some alternative to taxation that funds the government in a more self-sustaining way, that does not, as libertarians say, amount to theft, and may actually make a kind of voluntary taxation possible. Again, it wouldn't be voluntary taxation because it isn't taxation to begin with. It's that's not the right word to use for it. But there may be a way, because when libertarians, I mean, in the 20th century, there was a wave of libertarianism under the figurehead of Ayn Rand, that thought that voluntary taxation would be legitimate, and everyone sort of scratched their heads when Ayn Rand would propose this, and I'm no advocate for or proponent of objectivism or Ayn Rand. I'm simply mentioning her. I'm not supporting her, but I came across her general rhetoric on taxation when I was a teenager, reading The Fountainhead and sort of getting into what she thought about policy and philosophy. So, but the libertarians, this new wave of libertarianism in the 20th century under Ayn Rand, thought, well, voluntary taxation would be legitimate, and everyone just kind of scratched their heads, like, what the hell? I mean, how would that work? Why would if it were merely voluntary rather than obligatory? Why would people pay taxes? People are inherently rational and self-interested. Government wouldn't exist because no revenue would be generated for its existence, because if taxation were merely voluntary rather than obligatory, no one would pay taxes and the society would collapse, due to fiscal inadequacies in funding. But the thing is just because something on the surface seems paradoxical or unworkable or nonsensical doesn't mean we can't get out a way to make it work somehow. So, and I think that I may have come up with some way of realizing the libertarian ideal of voluntary taxation and responding and compromising with the argument that taxation is theft and that there isn't a good philosophical basis for the obligation to be taxed or to pay taxes in an obligatory way by force. So, okay, what would this alternative be? Because I've kind of rambled on and kind of disclaimed endlessly. So, what would this alternative be? Well, instead of taxing income, I would suggest that the government could tax interest on investments, right? It could tax, rather than income, it could tax investment earnings. What would this look like? The government would create a scheme, a policy scheme, that would create investment accounts, lucrative investment accounts working with the private sector for all citizens, right? The government would advertise these universal investment opportunities for members of all classes, not just the rich who have the excess capital to be able to invest, right? The government would sponsor, advertise, support, and create an investment scheme, if you will, a universal citizen investment scheme that anyone could put their hands into, right? That anyone could invest in, regardless of their income level, that would be lucrative, that would be, see, this is where this becomes more theoretical than practicable, that would be lucrative at any level of investment, right? Depending on what, depending on your income level and what you're capable of investing. I think that logistically that may be possible regardless, although you'd want to speak to someone more in economics, finance, and business. This is just an idea from a political scientist, not from an economist or from a financier. So I'm just making a proposal. I'm not necessarily reckoning with the realities, all of the realities, although I'll attempt to do that momentarily. Okay, so the government creates a universal citizen investment scheme, right? an American investment scheme. You could call it the American Dream investment scheme or something like that. It has a nice ring to it. And essentially the way that it would work is it would create universal investing opportunity for all citizens. Citizens, of course, would have an interest, a rational, classical libertarian self-interest in investing in these accounts. Why? Because it's profit for them. They have an interest in investing in something like this because it would profit them necessarily if we can create a lucrative line of universal citizen investing accounts working, as some sort of bargaining agreement or some, between the public and the private sector. So how would okay, so we have that idea, and so this is where the classical libertarian should be a bit titillated, because what this would do is it actually would not be mandatory for citizens to invest in these accounts. It would simply be to their interest, their rational self-interest, right, to do so, because it would profit them, right? Even if there are some in one cycle of the investment, the stock market, the investment market, perhaps there is some loss, but ultimately if we can create the right line of accounts at the proper times and remain on top of things with various government departments, these investments in these accounts would amount to a profit gain, to an economic gain of some level and of some kind. Thus, there'd be a rational self-interest for citizens to invest in these accounts and in this American Dream investment scheme. Now, how is that an alternative to taxation? Well, like this. If we can create the right line and advertise and manufacture a good line of investment accounts under this new government funding scheme, the government would no longer tax your income. You would invest a portion of that income in these investment accounts, which would expand your overall income. And because the government created these accounts in the first place, right, there is an element of trade between you and the government. The government can justify then, which is why this is an alternative to taxation, taxing, right, or taking a portion of the total earnings, the total gain that you got from investing whatever portion of your income in that account, right? Because the government is so in this way, we are funding the government through a process of mostly voluntary exchange between the citizen and the state, rather than the state forcing you to pay. So instead of, the government is funded by active voluntary exchange between the citizen and the state, not through force or mandate by the state, right? This is the state would be funded through exchange, voluntary exchange between citizen and state, not through extracting capital from the citizen with force, right? So in this sense, there's an exchange element, and so this would obviously make classical libertarians raging hard, because, well, very happy rather. That's not appropriate language, but would make them quite happy, because instead the state is being funded through a voluntary economic exchange between citizen and state, not through taking money from citizens by force, which they would regard as theft in principle, as philosophically and ethically equivalent to theft. Okay, so in this sense, the government would fund itself by providing this scheme, this line of lucrative investment accounts through coordinated workings between the public and private sector. The government would, in creating these accounts, which citizens would all buy into anyway, because it's in their rational self-interest to do so, would no longer fund itself by simply taxing your income, but by taking a portion of your gains that you got from investing your income in government-created investment accounts, right? Um, and in this sense, the government would no longer engage in an act of income reduction, right? Of reducing your income, of taking value from you. It would, in providing these accounts, ultimately create a gain or investment opportunity for you, and then simply siphon off a portion of those gains, right, from those investments. In that sense, government would no longer be taxing your income. It would no longer be reducing your income or imposing any kind of financial burden on you further, right? I mean, because we have a percentage tax system that is income-based, and the amount you're taxed is proportional to what you make in some sense, via this system of percentage taxation rather than flat taxation, taxing on income rather than consumption, which is the more popular, another popular alternative anyway. We lost my train of thought. We could potentially provide for all government fiscal need this way. But as I was saying, yes, I mean, the government wouldn't be reducing your income and taxing it, right? It would be providing a rationally beneficial investment opportunity for you, which you would logically invest in. The government, in doing so, would no longer be reducing your income, imposing financial burden in the form of taxation. It would be providing a fundamental opportunity for you to expand your income, and then it would simply siphon off a portion of the gains you get from investing in these accounts, right? In this sense, government would not tax income, it would tax interest on investments, or it would tax earnings from investments, it's so in that sense, under this scheme, and for the classical libertarian, it's totally justified then for the government to take a portion of these earnings, because it created the accounts, it provided the investment opportunity in the first place. In this sense, it's an exchange. Funding the government is a matter of a simple exchange of funds for services, right? It is no longer a matter of force between state and citizen. It is a matter of voluntary exchange, right? Mutually beneficial exchange between state and citizen. And so it changes the whole dynamic and provides a totally different way for the government to fund itself, right? So I think that's most certainly an interesting idea. I want to check my notes, though, to make sure that the brilliance of this is that we wouldn't need a separate social security system anymore either, right? People, in investing into these accounts, we may need to provide, right? In some cases, for those that don't invest, right? Some social security safety net for the retired and those that fall out of the capacity to work. But in general, through a creation of these investment accounts, these American, dream investment accounts, if you want to call them that, there could be we could remove the need for separate provision, right, for Social Security, right? This would be a different kind of security that would provide for retirement, in addition to doing a number of other things simultaneously. And I want to check my notes again just to make sure that, this is the thing. This is one brilliant thing about this system is, can you imagine how much the economy would be supercharged by universal citizen investing? I mean, it's not a rare shrewd few anymore that are investing, right? Having to take the active effort to seek out legitimate accounts and legitimate investment options, right? Universal investing in that way would mobilize capital and would mobilize currency in a way that supercharges the economy. There's now far more fluid capital, right, circulating within the economy. that would then give more and more opportunities for growth in business, right? So that, because the more that is invested, right, the more that businesses can grow, right? Because they no longer have to rely upon their own bootstraps. They can be lifted up through angel investors and stuff like that. So I believe that in this sense, it would not only fund the government and grow the income, right, each year, rather than take from the income, right, of citizens, but it would provide this huge economic supercharge, right, that would come from universal investing, rather than local investing for those who either can afford to do it in terms of accumulated capital, or those with the wits to do it in terms of knowledge and experience. So I think I'll wrap it up there. But this is the idea. I recognize there could be some naivete or idealism in it, because I would like to consult with maybe a couple people who are experts in finance and more knowledgeable of how investment games work. But I think it's at least an interesting theoretical proposition in terms of providing an alternative to conventional modes of funding the government, like income taxation. In a previous video, I talked about consumption taxation rather than income taxation, which is an indirect tax on income rather than a direct one. I ultimately ruled out the consumption tax in favor of the income tax. But if I could rule out taxation altogether and build something like this, I think that may actually be far better, not only for the people, but for the government. I think that ultimately it would generate sufficient revenue for the government. I think that it would expand the earnings of citizens rather than take from them. And I think that it would supercharge the economy, because it would create a dynamic of nearly universal investing by expanding the raw opportunity to do so in the form of these government accounts. I think that this is an interesting proposition, and I would love to hear some thoughts and ideas on the legitimacy of the ideas presented here. So that's where I'll end this. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe.